Hello, Standoff. Here is our next presentation, also about machine learning, is John Bambenek, who is going to speak about adversarial machine learning. And please stay tuned. It's going to be a real interesting one.
Good afternoon. My name is John Bambenek. My talk today is on adversarial machine learning and its impacts on cybersecurity. A little bit about myself. I am the president of Bambenek Labs. I produce threat intelligence feeds and machine learning powered security solutions. But this topic and my interest in this topic has actually stemmed from my PhD work, where I'm finishing my doctoral degree at the University of Illinois on cybersecurity machine learning, where my thesis is on multi-domain machine learning, of how to take the context and related indicators to come to more well-rounded and accurate conclusions on machine learning. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this talk is things that's actually come up from my academic research and how it's impacted some of the solutions that I provide professionally as well. So to start with the state of the problem, right, and this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek parody in a United States a magazine that says, there are so many vulnerable systems out on the internet that foreign governments are struggling to keep up with the amount of vulnerabilities there are. And you could replace China with U.S. Cyber Command or whatever government of choice there is that there is so much vulnerable. Good afternoon. My name is John Bambenek. My talk today is on adversarial machine learning and its impacts on cybersecurity. A little bit about myself. I am the president of Bambenek Labs. I produce threat intelligence feeds and machine learning powered security solutions. But this topic and my interest in this topic has actually stemmed from my PhD work, where I'm finishing my doctoral degree at the University of Illinois on cybersecurity machine learning, where my thesis is on multi-domain machine learning, of how to take the context and related indicators to come to more well-rounded and accurate conclusions on machine learning. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this talk is things that's actually come up from my academic research and how it's impacted some of the solutions that I provide professionally as well. So to start with the state of the problem, right, and this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek parody in a United States a magazine that says, there are so many vulnerable systems out on the internet that foreign governments are struggling to keep up with the amount of vulnerabilities there are. And you could replace China with U.S. Cyber Command or whatever government of choice there is that there is so much vulnerable information and information systems put out there that even the attackers have a hard time of drinking from that fire hose of vulnerability out there that's deployed in the wild. And that's just been a consistent problem, at least in my 20-some-odd years of cybersecurity, is that we keep putting more vulnerable stuff out there knowing that there's risks that we're not addressing. So one of the solutions that we have presented in the security industry is that we need more automation. There's a lot of information that's being generated by logs and SIM solutions. There is intrusion detection systems and endpoint, and there's only so many people to go around to manage all of those systems, to analyze the alerts. There's only so many analysts that you can put into a SOC. So people have proposed we need to automate a lot of things. And machine learning at its core is part of an automation process. But there's the idea of security orchestration and automated response and automated remediation as a way of dealing with the scale of our problem, because we simply can't scale the number of humans needed to resolve it. So what is machine learning? This is a comic from XKCD. Some of you may have seen it before. But machine learning, in terms of how data scientists take a look at it, is they do what's called unsupervised machine learning. You basically put all the data into it, and it says, oh, all of this data is clustered here, and all this data is clustered there. There really isn't a whole lot of understanding of why. And you can just kind of stir the data around until it starts looking right. But why this notion is important is how machine learning came to be from ad tracking companies and social media companies that really, they're just trying to do ad targeting. right? Why is Google so heavily invested in machine learning? That they're trying to display relevant ads to consumers to increase the likelihood that they'll buy things. So if you get a 20% increase in that, you're happy, as long as the amount of extra profit you make from that 20% is worth your ad spend. If you're having some false positives, no, that's no big deal. But obviously, the stakes change radically when applying it to machine learning. As I said, one of the use cases is ad tracking and related endeavors, basically to classify people into whether they're more or less likely to buy a given product based on whatever characteristics of that product is. There's been lots of machine learning in image classification and object recognition, and a malicious use case of deepfakes of this, of using these systems to say, hey, is this image a cat? Or is this image representing a specific person in facial recognition systems? There's natural language processing. Behind me or off to the side of me is an Amazon Echo that tries to listen to what I'm saying to process that language into instructions. And there's lots of other use cases for all of that. Of those three, you're primarily operating on benign data, all right? People aren't really manipulating ad tracking systems, more or less. They're either blocking them or not. But people are going about their day generating whatever browser traffic they generate. For image classifications, people go to Google Images or whatever and just say, here's my list of cat pictures. These are cats. Create features on that. Here's my pictures of dogs. For facial recognition of Facebook and other applications, right? Here's all the images that are benignly generated of that we put on the internet every day. Security automation is different in that our primary data set is malicious. And this is very important. All of our data is, if you're doing file classification, we have lots of data sets on malware. If you're doing domains, there's lots of malicious domain lists out there, or phishing or so on and so forth. We have very little benign data. So if you think, for example, if I want to create a behavioral machine learning model of how people use their machines, okay, I'm sure I could probably get a lot of incident response reports to say this is how this machine behaved when infected with malware. Would you put an agent on your machine that's going to look at all of what you do to create a model of what is benign? It's like, no, many people would have some very serious privacy concerns with that. So in cybersecurity machine learning, our primary data set is malicious and under the control and influence of the attacker. That comes with some very interesting and profound risks. But at a high level, machine learning provides three core functions, or what I define as three core functions. Classification. What is this object objectively, right? Is it a cat? Is it a dog? Is this image John Bambenek, or is this image somebody else? There's judgment, right? If things are good, bad, there's a qualitative indicator, right? In cybersecurity, is something malicious or is something benign, right? And then there's predicting outcomes, right? And based on these criteria is, should I write a loan or underwrite a loan or an insurance policy for this individual? Will this person develop cancer in 10 years? What have you? As you go from classification to judgment to predicting outcomes, you have decreasing reliability to the point where you almost have farce, right? We're pretty good with classification, right? As long as your data sets, your source data sets are okay. Judgment, again, right? You starting to get there. Predicting outcomes is ludicrous. And we'll talk about the differences between these when I talk about some of the adversarial machine learning risks that come with this. But like I said, there's decreasing reliability as things are more future looking. So we have a handful of current machine learning products that people are out there developing, right? A lot is open source. There's a ton out there on domain generation algorithms and detecting DGAs. I'm going to go to that example again, in part because a lot of my research is in DGAs. And ironically enough, I think it was 6 years ago, I spoke in PhDs in Moscow on domain generation algorithms. So it's been a long time professional and academic interest of mine. There's open source tools to detect phishing. Some of these are image classification, right? Does this web page look like a PayPal login that isn't on PayPal infrastructure? Some of it is just looking for lexical characteristics of spam, right? There is some open source machine learning on ransomware, because the behavior of ransomware is so very different than everything else. The problem with machine learning detection of ransomware is by the time you've detected the encryption process, it's already too late. Your organization has been taken hostage. But there are some commercial products also that have machine learning functionality built into them. There's a lot of endpoint tools out there that look at file characteristics and behavioral characteristics to detect malicious activity. There's scene-based analysis looking for events to try to elevate and correlate things to make sure the right stuff is raised to SOC analysts, even to the point of automated remediation. There's a lot of commercial products doing ML on the network layer and trying to do threat analysis at scale to at least take some of the load off of your SOC analysts. So we're starting to see these products out there, but there really hasn't been a whole lot of scrutiny paid to them in terms of whether they work and some of the risks that come with that. But why machine learning, right? There's a major benefit, or I said some major benefits, is I mentioned one is just the scale of human beings. If you think of reverse engineering malware, you could spend dozens of hours reversing one malware sample. Often I use a picture of a graph from VirusTotal about how many unique malware samples they see every day, and it's usually between 3 and 400,000. There just aren't enough reverse engineers to do all that reversing. Human beings make mistakes, right? And we know this. Phishing is an example of people making mistakes. Human beings don't pay attention to detail. Again, phishing is another great example, but even the various Punycode tricks to redirect people from legitimate sites to other sites. Business email compromise. You can go through a long list of things. And sometimes even analysts and professionals just miss things because there might be some detail that really made the difference one way or the other. Somebody might have jumped to conclusions, any number of things. And human beings just aren't consistent. We have good days, we have bad days. I haven't had my coffee this morning and maybe my productivity is less. So machine learning seeks to solve all of those, right? It does the process relatively fast to cluster data. Sure, that does solve that. It does it consistently. But the problem is the human element isn't gone, right? The human beings pick the features, right? And the features, the attributes the machine learning algorithm uses to make decisions about whatever. They choose the training set. And really, right, the machine learning outcomes is really driven by the training data that you feed it, of each class of data. And let's just say it's benign and malicious. How you pick that data has outsized and significant relevance to the outcome. And we really don't have good benign data sets. And sometimes our malicious data sets don't say what we think they say. Human beings decide the context of which this environment runs in. Where does it fit in a network? What set of solutions does it have? Or what set of network traffic is going through it? Where does it make decisions? How is it implemented? Right? Human beings evaluate the results. Right? What is a false positive in a machine learning system? It's what some human being decides it is. So again, the human element isn't gone. It's just moved away. And in machine learning generally, one of the interesting sociological phenomenon is it kind of takes away accountability, right? We're all security professionals. I'm sure everybody listening to this talk has probably broken production once in their life and once in their career. We've all done it. But in this case, in the case of breaking production, I did it, right? You get in trouble and life goes on. But in machine learning, we think, hey, this is just the algorithm. I didn't make a mistake. The algorithm made a mistake. Now it's no longer human accountability. It's accountability to linear mathematics. But there's not a lot of focus of where the human does come in, right? Of picking features in the training set and deciding the classes and how the ML runs and evaluating the results of where these things can fail. The short answer, the kind of pithy way of saying where machine learning is that machine learning can make human mistakes at machine speed, right? That automation isn't the panacea that it is purported to be, and there's lots of places human mistakes can enter into the system where those mistakes then can happen very fast at computer speeds and a very large scale if we're not careful. So that brings us to adversarial machine learning, right? And adversarial machine learning is the academic branch of machine learning that studies how an adversary can manipulate these systems to come to incorrect conclusions, right? All machine learning begins with training data, right? Is you have to train a model to make classifications. So you give it that training data. If it's image classifications, you might be training a system to recognize handwriting. So there's a data set called MNIST, M-N-I-S-T, that is 10,000 images of handwritten numerals, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And it's used very prominently in research, right? Here's what human handwriting will look like in terms of classifying these digits. But here's a thought experiment. What if you can poison that training data? Now, for image classification, that's kind of hard. We go to known benign things, right? For even facial recognition, you can go to Facebook. It's primarily good, right? So Facebook, Google Images. If you're doing natural language processing, you can go to a library and start having it operate off of library books. There's lots of human language out there to analyze. Lots of images out there that are otherwise benign. Well, like I said from the start of this, with cybersecurity, we start on malicious data, right? So here's a corpus of malware files. Here's malicious traffic. Here's phishing emails. And all of this is generated by an adversary that has decades of experience of trying to fool automated systems. If you think about phishing emails and the evolution of anti-spam technology over almost 30 years now, really, is people who engage in phishing and spam generally have been trying to fool these automated systems for a good long time, right? They may not be machine learning, but they're automated. There's a lot of malicious traffic out there designed to evade firewalls and to evade intrusion detection systems. Malware trying to avoid antivirus and endpoint tools. All of these systems are already created by people who have decades of experience trying to trick our technology stack to believe that their malicious stuff is in fact benign. And we'll come back to this point a couple of times in this presentation, but it can't be emphasized enough is we look at machine learning as this new thing of automated systems, but we're dealing with adversaries who've been fooling automated systems for decades, right? Even buffer overflows. And really, when it comes down to a machine learning, is how do you have an automated processing system safely process data on untrusted inputs, which is essentially the same problem you have with SQL injection and the same problem you have with buffer overflows. And while there have been improvements, those problems are still with us today. So vulnerability one, we'll talk about poisoning. So it's an example of domain names. And we'll start with benign. Right, and I like this example a lot because it's illustrative of the difficulty we have in cybersecurity machine learning. Is think of a whitelist of domains. You want to generate not just a couple of domains that you'd whitelist, but something you could say, these 100,000, these 250,000, these 1 million domains, we know that they are good, so do your processing off of that. So people will use Majestic or Umbrella or Alexa. There's another one out there that's supposed to be a little bit more resilient to tampering called Tranco. And those can't be manipulated, right? Now, bear in mind, The whitelist is doing a little bit of sleight of hand here. Majestic, Umbrella, Alexa aren't creating lists of known good domains. What they're doing is creating lists of popular domains, and there's this kind of sleight of hand. Well, if it's popular, it must be safe. And there's lots of very prominent examples of why that's not so. But let's just talk about manipulating the data. Of course it can be, right? There is black hat search engine optimization. There is social media amplification. There's traffic delivery systems, all of which are designed to artificially inflate the prominence of a given website or a given domain, and it already exists today, right? Even before machine learning, criminals have been using this for decades for a wide variety of attacks. They can repurpose it at any time for manipulating those popularity lists to try to manipulate our machine learning systems, right? Because eventually, if you start with your training set of benign domains and you've got malicious domains in there, all of a sudden you're very quickly skewing the system that it won't recognize badness when when that badness is truly happening. So as a point, I like demonstrating here is some of the differences. We're not even looking at the problem correctly. Is in academic research, when we talk about adversarial machine learning, and the subtext of this image isn't so much important, but it's talking about, hey, if we modify these pixels in this image this way and that way, instead of a panda that you recognized on the left, you get a gibbon that you recognized on the right by applying this pixel stuff. Well, that's interesting, but image classification and certainly object recognition and things like moving cars, that's not even a remotely viable attack scenario. That's just not what the attackers do. The criminal data, the criminal element out there is not doing all of these high-end mathematical attacks. They're doing something like this, right? This is an image where you've got an individual who's wearing, in essence, a projector on his head to project images and other facial features on top of his own face, so that when a facial recognition camera looks at him, it can no longer accurately place whatever features it is on its face it's looking for. The eyebrows look different. The eyes look different, somewhat deformed. Where exactly are the nostrils? Where's the mouth? The cheekbones look different, right? There's all sorts of things that people do that are relatively simple and not mathematically complex that create these big problems. In fact, with COVID-19 and some of the changes, facial recognitions have had a hard time keeping up with accuracy just wearing the masks that we all now wear in public. They're starting to get better in accommodating that, but that kind of black swan event has had a great impact on facial recognition systems, because now we are behaving differently, and the features that are observable by these systems has reduced greatly. But you get an idea of nobody's really trying to do this complex Gaussian transform of images. They're doing things like this, or wearing masks that change things. But again, to go back to the point, the adversary has tons of experience doing this already, right? This is not even new to them. And the way we study attacks against our systems are not at all what attackers would do, right? If you were red teaming a machine learning system, you wouldn't be doing what you saw on the first slide. You'd be doing what you're doing on the second slide. So as an example, there's lots of concern about disinformation in a lot of developed countries around the world. And particularly social media amplification of how people are amplifying disinformation using social media companies. Well, there's an example of Operation, and it was called Operation Shitter in 2009, which was launched from 4chan and basically wanted to manipulate the trending topics, and enough people got together, tweeted the same hashtags, and all of a sudden the most popular hashtags on the trending topics would be something that was adversarial controlled. And how do foreign countries spread disinformation? Exactly what 4chan and script kiddies did 11 years ago. I mean, the techniques have gotten refined somewhat, But really, at its core, it's the same thing that's been developed for decades, or in this case, a decade, and it still works by and large, right? How do you amplify something, disinformation on social media? You get a bunch of unrelated accounts tweeting about it and talking about it, and then it's just a math problem, right? And you can start poisoning machine learning systems with that. Twitter's implemented a lot of machine learning now in terms of finding relevant trending topics. But even then, we still see a lot of manipulation going on there simply based on a lot of people piling in and saying the same things. So machine learning generally operates by classification for the most part, right? Is this object a cat or a panda? Is it malicious? Is it a specific individual, right? But those, again, are decided by people, and it's had some pretty awful bias problems. So, for instance, facial recognition systems work pretty well if the subject is a white individual. They work pretty poorly when they're dealing with Africans. But classes can also be hard to decide. And you have essentially two problems. They can be too coarse or they can be too narrow. And there's a lot of sleight of hand involved in creating classifications. So going back to my example about DGAs, or more broadly, machine-generated domain names. The entire point of DNS is to make the internet human accessible. We can't remember IP addresses, not at scale. We're certainly never going to remember IPv6 addresses. So, but I can remember google.com or standoff.com or bambenekconsulting.com, right? Those are memorable human words. With DGAs and machine-generated domains, you know they're not designed for humans because no human being is going to remember 20 random characters, right? We know malware uses it and has for the better part of a decade. But ad trackers and related technology use it as well, and for similar reasons, right? It's really not designed for human use. It's designed for machine use, so I don't really need to make it human memorable. And they have a need for resiliency, right? There's ad blocking software out there, and ad tracking companies try to get around it. So if you're creating a classification, and if you take a look at machine learning in Google Scholar or on GitHub, there are tons of classifiers to recognize DGAs. The problem is that your class contains both good and bad or less bad data, right? Ad trackers may not be desirable, but that's far different than ransomware, right? They operate in different planes. And you've got a very coarse classification, right? Is this a DGA that you're turning around and really you're doing a sleight of hand of passing off a classification as a judgment, right? Is something malicious is a judgment. A DGA is just a classification. Hey, this is not a human readable domain name. Okay, that's relevant data, but that's not enough to make a judgment, right? So your defense against this is just like a good, like having a good red team. Your data science or machine learning efforts should have somebody out there with an attacker mindset that's looking, how would I attack this system if I were a criminal, right? And do we even have machine learning red teams? Well, not yet. We should. There's a lot of security implications, not just in cybersecurity machine learning, but just in how machine learning is deployed in a wide variety of industries that is growing, right? Who is probing how these systems can be manipulated? And, why isn't there something like OWASP for machine learning? And there should be. So class 2, right, or vulnerability 2 is what I call class confusion, right? What if you can make, the NSA look like Facebook in terms of classification, right? If you're a government that views the United States adversarially, right, you're going to be concerned about what the NSA is doing. You're probably less concerned about what Facebook is doing. But depending on how you choose your features, they might look very similar, right? The NSA takes lots of electronic data. Facebook takes lots of electronic data. Both of those entities executes on whatever objectives they want to find. the NSA and intelligence agencies, well, assassination is a tool in their tool chest. Facebook probably hasn't killed anybody yet. But the point is depending on how you pick your features and define your classes, you can get very interesting correlative data that correlates together, like the NSA looking like Facebook. So here's an interesting thought exercise, right? Define malicious software, right? You're going to create a classification system that identifies malware. Okay, everybody's going to put ransomware on that list. Probably is going to put stalkerware on that list. But interestingly enough, the tools and techniques I use to monitor my young children's online behavior and keep them safe is also the same kind of tools and techniques would allow me to, if I were so inclined, to stalk and otherwise be hostile towards my spouse, right? You have potentially unwanted applications, crypto miners, right? It's undesirable. What about consensual adware? There's, lots of applications out there people download. I'll show you banner ads or whatever for a couple of cents an hour, and people download that. It's not so much a thing anymore, but I remember the day when, you could add in toolbars into a browser. And when I was supporting organizations, there'd always be some guy or some person that would have 6 browser toolbars, and the computer would start performing poorly. Would you define that as malicious, right? So defenses against this, right? There is supervised machine learning where you feed it labeled data. This is good, this is bad. Unsupervised machine learning is when you just feed it data and you let the system come up with its own clustering and classification. Don't do that other than just doing pure and interesting research, right? That's never going to yield good results in a production environment. But spend real time on classes and what else is included in a class and not. And think about it, right? And bear in mind when sleight of hand is happening between a classification and a judgment. But we also need to keep in mind the attacker is going to know our classes. They're going to know, hey, this system is looking at domain names and doing good or bad. It's pretty self-explanatory. That gives them information to make manipulations. Because the bad news is almost everything we do on the defensive side of cybersecurity anyway is essentially public. Even our tools, right? If I want to analyze if my attack is safe against a specific EDR tool, I could just buy the EDR tool, install it in a lab machine, and test my attacks. VirusTotal scans a given file against 63 antivirus engines. A lot of people will turn around and say, well, hey, machine learning models are proprietary. The attacker will never have that. Well, in adversarial machine learning, there's this concept of transferability. And what this means is, if I have a model that's approximately like another model, the same attack will work against both. It will be transferred between them. So I can look at the white paper or some PDF or PowerPoint sales deck of some cybersecurity company's machine learning tool, get an idea of the attributes they're looking at, get an idea of their classes, and all I have to do is create a roughly similar model to what they're having, and the same attacks work against both. So now I don't even need to buy a given tool. I just need to get a white paper or watch somebody's talk at a conference to get an idea of how I need to build such a system in a lab environment to test my attacks, right? And figure out, okay, where are my data? Where can I input data? They do exactly what people finding buffer overflows and fuzzing do today. Find where they can manipulate data and start trying to incrementally poison things or manipulate systems to make bad decisions. So this is our third vulnerability. It's openness, right? It's also what I call the VirusTotal problem, is that our attackers can run as many attacks as they want until they get it right. The unfortunate reality in machine learning is if they can build our machine learning model in a private environment, we have no idea that they're testing against us. With VirusTotal, Yeah, I can upload my malware to VirusTotal, but as I'm sure everybody here knows, I also can download that piece of malware as a security researcher if I pay Google Chronicle for a subscription. In fact, VirusTotal is the world's largest malware honeypot for testing SQL injection or fuzzing for a remote buffer overflow. Hopefully, I will see those problems in an IDS or a web application firewall. But if I can create a simulated environment in a private lab, I have no way to know that somebody's attacking it, right? And of course, not every attack is the same. Is that while all of our tools are public and all of our defenses are essentially public or at least accessible to the criminal, the adversary can develop their malware, their buffer overflow attacks or phishing stuff in a vacuum. They just have to create something that's different and unique that can no longer be classified appropriately. So are defenses, right? You want to try to make the models a little bit ambiguous. And by that, I mean, don't necessarily force the models to make decisions, right? As a security researcher, I'm sure many of you know this, is of those 300,000 to 400,000 unique samples of malware on VirusTotal, the overwhelming majority are known stuff. I don't need to take a look at another sample of Emotet. I know how the malware works. I don't need to see each iteration except maybe pull out interesting intelligence points out of it, right? But even then, in cybersecurity events, most of the time, things are obviously good or obviously bad. But people like, and data scientists in particular, like forcing decisions on machine learning. Thou shalt decide, is this good or is this bad? Well, create it ambiguous. Say, you know what? If I'm 90% confident that this is good or 90% confident that this is bad, okay, we can make decisions based off of that. But then look at where the stuff in the middle is. Well, it thinks this was good, but it wasn't as confident, because that's where your interesting data lives. Because that's where, your attackers will fall through the cracks. They want to make something that looks good enough to fool a system, but still does the bad thing they're looking for. So in machine learning systems, you really want to look at those things that kind of fall in the middle. It's leaning towards good or leaning towards bad, but it wasn't enough to be fully confident in that decision. That either means you need to train your model more, right? Or that the attacker is doing something new that you should be taking a look at. But never, ever, ever take a human out of the mix. Definitely let analysts reinforce the model, have them actually do the work of doing the research on the indication, right? While your model is new, then have 10% of all the incidents or events or whatever it's doing the analysis on, go to an analyst who makes a decision and does the analysis, right? If it's a SOC alert, have the analyst work it without the benefit of machine learning. If the analyst and the model come up to the same answer, okay, you can reinforce that. When the model is established, right, still do it 1% of the time, right? And these are kind of subjective numbers because you want to monitor for when things might change. And definitely, again, go back to the notion of having other eyes look at machine learning systems, right, is have that hunt team look for ambiguous results. And the system wasn't as certain here. I'm going to go look at that and figure out why. Maybe my model needs tuning. Maybe the attacker is doing something interesting. Uncovering both is very valuable to an organization. And I'll give you an example of how things can change. I had a domain classifier, right? Just given a domain name, it would look at various DNS characteristics and records and a wide variety of things to decide, is this domain malicious or is it benign? I skipped past compromised because that is its own special problem, right? The model was 100% accurate, right? Or I should say there's no detectable false positives until late February, early March of this year. Because due to coronavirus, governments started putting up a website and infrastructure to deal with the outbreak and doing public information campaigns and things for jobs and so forth. So my model started catching public health authorities and disrupting their activities. So in my career, I don't know if I ever would have thought disrupting a public health entity in a pandemic was a kind of false positive risk I had to deal with, but here we are. The reason the model failed is that in that brief time of organizations struggling to respond, they were setting up infrastructure the same way criminals were. Just throw it out there, get it up, forget about all the hardening things. We don't care about SPF and DKIM and DMARC. Don't worry about DNSSEC. Just get it out there on a VPS or in a cloud or whatever and just get it done, right? Versus the very, especially in public health and government, that is very detail-oriented and process-driven. These human beings behind those decisions were making similar decisions the criminal did. So the model didn't fail. It's just the reality changed around the model for a brief period of time, and there needed to be more well-rounded analysis. And that's why you have a hunt team and looking for things that are ambiguous, because, like I said, sometimes the reality can just change. So spotting machine learning snake oil, right? We're all defenders, or, well, we're not all be defenders. We all work for security companies. There's lots of security companies out there who are selling machine learning related products, right? You ask the vendors how they deal with the above risks, right? But start with these 4 questions. Where do they curate their training data, right? Where do they get their good data, right? Especially in cybersecurity, where do they get their benign data? How do they update it, right? A model once created isn't going to be accurate in perpetuity, right? My domain classifier was 100% accurate until it wasn't. Right? Reality changes, attackers' techniques changes, and even the way that we behave with technology changes, right? How do they define their classes? Are they doing unsupervised versus supervised machine learning, right? You know, and some will say, hey, but our algorithms are proprietary. That's not really a good answer to this question, right? But machine learnings can classify. You know, they're starting to get better at judgment, but predicting outcomes is hard. Right? There are behavioral analysis companies that are looking at doing machine learning based on user behavior to predict whether somebody might be an insider risk. You know, there has to be radical evolutions in the technology in feature set to predict whether somebody is going to be a future insider risk to an organization using machine learning, right? Odds are if somebody's peddling you that, they're peddling snake oil. And more importantly, that right there, the predicting outcomes, is where the real human rights abuses and machine learning can take place, right? If you're firing somebody because your ML system decided they were an insider risk and they weren't, right? You know, there's definitely unfairness there, and trying to appeal it, well, but the algorithms, how do you appeal it? There is lots of room for very significant bad in there. That's really going to be an emerging societal problem here in the coming years. So this brings me to the end of my presentation, right? This was pre-recorded, so I am online to answer questions, and I'll give you some time for that now. If you do want to reach out to me, there's my email address. I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn. I do have a website as well. But thank you for the opportunity to present to you again. Unfortunately remote, because that's the environment we find ourselves in. But I certainly did like the 2 times I was in Moscow for PH days some years ago, and glad that I can make this presentation available to you as well. And I hope you find value with that. And with that, I will be here and available for questions.